me because we're actually going to be streaming this live via Facebook and YouTube. So I've never actually been live in this sort of form or way before. So there is a couple of housekeeping matters because we are going live. Mobile phones, if you got them, put them on silent or turn them off, please, because A, there's nothing more distracting as a speaker if your phone goes off, and B, if once we're streaming live, it'll pick up on the audio. So please, mobile phones silent or off. Secondly, we're going to have some time towards the end of the talk, and we're going to, for question times, for questions, if you could please use the microphones. We've got some roving mics up the front here with David and Tom. People out there on the internet won't be able to hear your question if you don't use the microphone. It's that simple. So please, use the mics, turn your phones off, and that's about it. Okay, so the barrage will lift, as they say, in the next minute or so. I'm going from my mobile phone, and we'll take it from there. Oh, trust me, it's on silent. I have to eject myself from the talk if it wasn't the case. Yeah. Absolutely, that's right. Facebook is live. Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much for coming here. My name is Aaron Pegram. I'm a senior historian in the military history section here at the Australian War Memorial, and it's my pleasure to be here with you to talk about the actions fought by the Australian Imperial Force during the first months of 1918, during the German Spring Offensive. Now, unless you've been living under a rock for the past 4 years, now we are in the midst of the First World War centenary. There was a great... we heard a lot of media attention at the outbreak of the First World War centenary in August 2014. We certainly heard a lot for the Gallipoli centenary in 2015. And every now and again, historians have been getting on TV and writing opinion pieces about the importance of the fighting on the Western Front. Now, I'm particularly excited by this phase in the fighting on the Western Front because 2018 is by far the most important year in terms of Australia's combat experience in the fighting on the Western Front. Not only on the Western Front was where the Australians were engaged in the main theatre of operations against the main enemy of the war, the Imperial German Army. It was on the Western Front in France and Belgium where the Australians made their greatest contribution to the outcome of the war. And we, later on this year, will be learning a little bit more about the Allied offensives, the actions fought by the Australians and the rest of the British Empire throughout the latter stages of 1918. Most notably, the 8th of August, Die Schwarze Tag, as the German general Erich Ludendorff referred to it, the Black Day of the German Army, and then also the anniversary of the armistice on the 11th of November. All very important milestones in terms of the First World War centenary. My talk today is going to be looking at the first half of 1918 and the very dire situation in which the Entente, the Allied powers or the Allied armies faced during the opening stages of that final year of the Great War. And I'm going to begin by telling the story of Sgt Stan McDougald of the 47th Battalion, who 100 years ago yesterday single-handedly broke up a German attack near the French village of Dernancourt before dawn on the 28th of March 1918. The exhausted battalions of the Australian 12th Brigade were stretched out along a railway embankment outside Dernancourt village, where they and elements of the British 35th Division formed a very thin defensive screen that sought to blunt wave after wave of German troops advancing on the nearby city of Amiens. MacDougall had allowed his men to stand down when he heard German troops moving around in the dark, forming up to an attack. Running along the top of the embankment, he saw a party of the enemy in the misty half-light of dawn, advancing towards his portion of the line. MacDougall roused a nearby Lewis gun team who were killed in the opening volley of fire. Snatching up their gun, MacDougall began firing from the hip as German troops spilled over the embankment. After a dozen or so sustained bursts, the gun's cooling jacket began to sear itself into MacDougall's hand. But he managed to keep it into action until his ammunition eventually ran out. He then collected a rifle off the battlefield and put a bayonet through a German officer who was levelling his automatic pistol at 2 Australian soldiers. In the end, concerted and vigorous fire from the 47th Battalion's position caused the assaulting German infantry to waver in confusion and their attack to fail. And for his actions that morning, Stan McDougald was awarded the Victoria Cross. And for those of you who are here at the Australian War Memorial, you'll be able to see Stan McDougald's Lewis gun that he used during that VC action and his Victoria Cross medal group in the Hall of Valour. The fighting at Dernancourt saw some of the most intense infantry action involving the Australian Imperial Force during the German Spring Offensive of 1918. 100 years on, it is worth considering the actions fought by the Australians during this critical phase during the First World War that culminated in the Allied victory just several months later. Now, following Russia's withdrawal from the war in the spring of 1918, the German army had transferred over 1 million soldiers to the fighting on the Western Front. And on 21st of March, launched a major offensive in the Saint-Quentin sector south of Arras. And that succeeded and ended over 3.5 years of static warfare on the Western Front. This is a map that I've kindly ripped off the New Zealand history.gov.nz Facebook website, and it's an excellent map that shows the series of not just one German offensive, but a series of German offensives that began in March 1918 and went all the way through to about July. And this is the area in which we're going to be talking about here. This is where the Australians are primarily engaged around the city of Amiens. We're going to be talking a little bit more about up the north here around Ypres and Hazebrouck in the French region of Artois. This area down here on the Somme is referred to as Picardy, and down in the south is Champagne. Known as Operation Michael, the major offensive that was carried out began on the 21st of March 1918 was one of 4 that materialised in the west in 1918. Michael took place on the old Somme battlefields in Picardy. Georgette was on the Lys and at Ypres in Artois, Blucher-York against the French in the Champagne region, with Gneisenau with an extension of the latter offensive, seeking to draw in Allied reserves and link up with German troops on the outskirts of Amiens. Now, Michael was considered the main thrust of the overall offensive and sought to capture the vital supply and logistical hub of Amiens, which would effectively sever all links between the British and French forces engaged along the Somme River and allow the Germans to advance and capture the Channel ports. Now, I think that's really important. The Somme River splits the British and the French armies engaged in the fighting on the Western Front, with the British holding everything north up until around here where the Belgians take over, and then everything south is the French army. So by assaulting the British, the Allies along the Somme River, what the Germans attempt to do is achieve a breakthrough. The French would withdraw south to protect Paris, okay, and the British to the north to protect the Channel ports, leaving an open gateway to the coast. Okay. And here we have a painting, Arthur Streeton's painting of the Amiens Cathedral. Very, a Gothic cathedral that's been around since nearly the Middle Ages, and it's a centerpiece of Amiens. Despite it dominating the skyline then, it still does today. The Amiens Cathedral survived not just 1 but 2 world wars, which I think is quite outstanding. Okay. Following a 5-hour hurricane bombardment firing over 1 million shells across a 100-kilometre front, elite German stormtrooper units trained to infiltrate and bypass the Allied defences succeeded in penetrating the Allied front line, ending, as I said, over 3 years of trench warfare on the Western Front. The British Third Army and the Arras sector and the Fifth Army on the old Somme battlefields were completely caught by surprise. They became divided and were forced to withdraw, allowing German troops to advance on Amiens. In 5 days, German troops succeeded in recapturing all the ground that was lost during the Battle of the Somme in 1916, which included towns and villages where Australians had fought and died during the bitter campaigns of 1916 and 1917. Which were now well behind German lines, which included Bullecourt, Bapaume, Pozières, and Mouquet Farm. Now, this map, again, which I've ripped from Wikipedia, it shows the strength of that German onslaught. It began here at Saint-Quentin, along the Saint-Quentin Canal, and just within a few days had advanced over 60 kilometres towards Amiens. Okay. And some of these areas we're going to be talking about in some great detail. But here we have Arras in the north, Amiens and Saint-Quentin over here in the east. Okay. The British suffered exceptionally heavy casualties in the opening onslaught and withdrew the withdrawal that followed. But the AIF was fortunate in that it was spared much of the fighting during this period. The only Australian units then engaged were the airmen of the Australian Flying Corps, whose SE-5As and Sopwith Camels bombed and strafed the advancing German columns from sunrise to sunset. Captain Arthur Cobby of No. 4 Squadron Australian Flying Corps described the skies around Saint-Quentin being, and I quote, full of aircraft, and continuously, while shooting up the troops on the ground, we would be attacked by enemy scouts. The smoke of battle mixed with the clouds and mists above, rendering flying particularly dangerous. The infantry was still in Belgium, where they had spent the previous winter months recovering from the 77,000 casualties incurred the previous year in bitter fighting at Bullecourt, Messines, and the infamous Third Battle of Ypres. Although this had been a time of relative quiet, and I mean relative in Western Front standards, the Australians were still being bombarded with artillery and gas and going out on trench raids. The AIF was still badly under strength and still reeling from its losses in the fighting at Ypres and after. The situation was exacerbated by voluntary recruiting being at an all-time low, conscription being twice rejected in bitterly contested plebiscites, and the usual winter wastage through illness. All told, the Australians began the final year of the First World War short by about 18,000 men. Now, command of the 5 Australian infantry divisions had been centralised when the Australia Corps was formed in November 1917, not under Monash, but under the British commander, Lieutenant General Sir William Birdwood. But such was the seriousness of the situation developing in France during the German offensive that the Australians were sent south to defend Amiens as separate divisions, brigades and battalions attached to a variety of British formations. And I think that's a really important point. Some of the actions for which we're going to be hearing about may not sort of echo in the Australian consciousness like Pozieres or Gallipoli, mainly because there's only a relatively small number of Australian troops, a battalion size rather than an Australian corps size, involved in their fighting. Now, what the Australian Imperial Force lacked in numbers, it made up in confidence, with the men of the 3rd and 4th Australian Divisions said to have been straining on the leash upon hearing news of the fighting in the south. The 4th Australian Division was rushed by bus to Hermerville, northwest of Arras, so just up around this area up here, where its 4th Brigade was sent to relieve the shattered remnants of the British 19th Division defending the village of Heberton, where a gap had opened on the 3rd Army front. The 4th Brigade was attached to the British 62nd Division and on the 27th of March repelled multiple attacks in the form of German field guns blazing away out in the open and infantry advancing in waves in short rushes through long grass where they fell open prey to some British guns. For the men of the 13th Battalion, holding the village of Heberton was, and I quote, purely bayonet work. The holding of it for the first few strenuous days was purely rifle work, for not only we had no artillery, but our ammunition supplies were so short that we could not afford to use machine guns freely. And our bomb supply, hand grenades, were soon exhausted, end quote. Fortunately, no further German attempts were made at Heberton, nor the Germans were successful in exploiting that gap. But such was the success of the Australians in this sector that the British commander of 7th Corps was unwilling to entrust the defence of Heberton to anyone else but the 4th Brigade. Having arrived on the Western Front in late 1916, the troops of the 3rd Australian Division under Major General Sir John Monash had never been to the Somme. They were bitterly disappointed to receive orders on the 25th of March to move to Ypres in Belgium, where it was initially planned that they were to be held in reserve. But at the last hour, the division was ordered to move south by rail to the village of Doullens, again in the 3rd Army sector near Arras. They arrived to secure the town while a particularly tense conference between British and French High Command took place over plans to stem the German breakthrough. Now, no sooner had that particular conference ended, a crisis developed on the British 7th Corps front immediately south of Albert. unexpected troop movements attributed to the misinterpretation of orders left a 16-kilometre stretch of ground in the bare high triangle defined by the rivers Somme and the river Ancre, largely undefended behind a scratch force holding the old Amiens defence line. Monash's troops were immediately sent to plug the gap, finding themselves the only traffic moving forward towards the Germans. French civilians and British soldiers streamed past in the opposite direction in their droves. Time and again they were told by passers-by that they had no chance of stopping the advancing Germans. By mid-morning on the 27th of March, the 3rd Division's 11th Brigade relieved the few exhausted British troops on the northern banks of the Somme, while the 12th and 13th Brigades from the 4th Australian Division took over from the exhausted Scots of the British 9th Division at Dernancourt on the River Ancre. Okay, so we'll just go back to this map here. Okay, so the 3rd Australian Divisions rushed south to plug up this gap in here. So we have the River Ancre running from Amiens past Sailly-le-Sec all the way up through the north, and the River Somme, which is running roughly west to east down this way. And this is the area to which we are referring to. Now, the 2 Australian divisions engaged German troops over the following days with mixed success. At noon on the 28th of March, Monash's troops in the triangle between the 2 rivers carried out an assault towards the town of Moulincourt in an attempt to add depth to the existing British defences and shore up positions from which a further attack could be launched. Drawing on battalions from 2 different brigades, the plan ultimately lacked cohesion and adequate fire support. The 40th Battalion on the left conducted a frontal assault, while the 42nd and 43rd Battalions on the right sought to bite off ground through aggressive patrolling. The latter attack started late, leaving the 40th Battalion in the drizzling rain, without flanking support when it bumped into two advancing German regiments. On the right, the 44th Battalion received instructions to slip off the heights to capture the village of Sailly-le-Ret on the northern banks of the Somme, where it was hit by German troops about 270 metres short of its objectives. And within a matter of hours, the 3rd Australian Division had lost around 300 men for relatively modest gain. It's really important. I've shown a photograph here of men of the 3rd Division on holding the northern banks of the Somme River. And of course, these are the guys who are quite conscious of the fact that they've been on the Western Front since November 1916 and never been to the Somme like the rest of the AIF. And this is their first major first major action, I guess, fought during the fighting here on the Somme. And just want to have a look at the photograph and the positions, the importance of the positions that they are holding. They're holding high ground on what's called Moulincourt Ridge, and here we have the Somme River at Sailly-le-Ret. Hamel village is a little bit further up to the north there. Any fire from those positions can be swept over on the low ground. It's the importance of high ground in this war, and the Australian 3rd Division has a lot of it holding Moulincourt Ridge. The 3rd Division saw this as one of the crowning achievements on the Western Front, holding Moulincourt Ridge, so much so that's where they decided to erect their divisional memorial after the First World War. The 2 Australian brigades of the 4th Division near Dernancourt had more success, albeit under a very different set of circumstances. Set up along the railway embankment just outside the village, the 47th and 48th Battalions poured devastating fire on German troops who succeeded in infiltrating parts of the Australian positions and threatened to roll up their flanks in the early hours of 28th of March 1918. Now, Stan McDougall single-handedly broke up an enemy probe that advanced over the railway crossing, but the main German assault hit the 47th Battalion further north along the line. Captain George Mitchell of the 48th Battalion formed part of the Australian defences immediately south of Albert and described, and I quote, "lines of grey-clad men doubled out of the sunken roads towards us. Waist high over the bank, we met them with rapid fire." He says, "Our Lewis gunners, disdaining the frontal attack, hammered away with staccato bursts to the right, where black masses moved towards the 47th Battalion. Weaker and weaker became the advancing lines before our flailing fire, till at 80 yards all movement ceased. Our Lewis guns still chopped away at the right, where the main attack was. I was blazing away with a rifle, having a lovely time, sending a swear word with every bullet." Advancing German troops had by this stage had penetrated 60 kilometres into the British front line and were almost within striking distance of Amiens. Much of these actions that are going to be fought during this year, in 1918, are not fought from muddy trenches. It's over green fields, which for most of the war had been far behind British lines out of artillery range. That's why when we see photographs and artworks of the fighting from around this period, they take on a bit of a brighter hue. The war, trench warfare had come to an end, and the fluid mobile warfare characterised the fighting during this period. Now, even though the outer suburbs of Amiens were on fire from long-range German shelling from large German railguns, by 28th of March, it was quite clear that the German drive towards Amiens was beginning to lose momentum. Germany's rapid advance across the devastated Somme battlefields strained its logistical infrastructure, with bottlenecks caused by the shortage of horses and lack of motorised transport, making it exceptionally difficult to bring up stores and supplies. Casualties among the assaulting German units were exceptionally heavy, especially among the skilled and experienced junior officers and NCOs who had led the offensive from the front. The long-term effects of the war had also affected the advancing German infantry, who plundered British and French supply depots after years of material shortages, wartime rationing and ersatz foodstuffs. German attacks were beginning to wane, being nowhere near as formidable or successful as they had been over the previous days. On the 30th of March, for example, men of the 11th Brigade on the Morlancourt Ridge broke up a concerted German attempt to penetrate the British lines near Saley-Lorette. Exhausted, German troops were able to muster one final drive towards Amiens, with 15 infantry divisions assaulting the British north of Albert and towards the Avre River on the 4th of April. Senior German commanders made the decision to strike at the outermost defences of Amiens that centred on the town of Villers-Bretonneux. From Hill 104, just north of Villers-Bretonneux, German artillery had direct line of sight on Amiens and could shell it with its long-range guns, hampering the vital railway hub that played such a prominent role in British and French operations in northern France. This is a wartime photograph of Hill 104, and Australians know it today because that's the site of the Australian National Memorial just north of Villers-Bretonneux. And you can see this area is relatively flat, and that little hill, 104, it's probably 104 metres above sea level, is a slight bump. It's just hardly a ridgeline by Australian standards. There's the Australian National Memorial that's there today. And there's the view from the top of the Australian National Memorial. This is what the Germans were trying to achieve. You can see that there? It's the outer suburbs of Amiens. You can see Amiens on a good clear day from Hill 104. Now, days earlier, Australian troops of the 9th Brigade of the 3rd Division crossed the River Somme and were sent to bolster the British 61st Division positions just east of Villers-Bretonneux, falling in between the 14th Division to the north and the 18th to the south. Now, this map requires a bit of explanation. It's a bit hard to see because it's so rich in detail, but it does show a number of things. It relates to the fighting in August 1918, and it shows the area where we are talking about today. Up here, along here, we have the Roman Road, okay, on which Villers-Bretonneux is located. That's Villers-Bretonneux there. We have the high triangle between the two rivers, the Ancre and the Somme. Okay, and the 3rd Division guys have slipped off the heights around here. This is Hamel village, which during the fighting, during this period of the war is behind German lines. And they've slipped off to hold the British positions here against mounting attacks from the Germans who are coming in this direction. Now, on the 30th of March 1918, the troops of the 9th Brigade of the 3rd Division carried out a successful but costly bayonet assault against German troops who had gained ground near Hangard Wood, and on 4th of April were in the thick of fighting when 2 divisions of German infantry hit the 35th Battalion's positions after deluging Villers-Bretonneux with gas and high explosives. There's another quote here from Lieutenant Colonel Henry Goddard. From the thick mist, masses of German infantry appeared. We were ready for them with every rifle, Lewis gun and machine gun came into action instantly. We had no wire or defences, but the German troops sagged and withered under our fire. All was going well when the troops on our left started to retreat and went back at the run, abandoning everything. Faced with overwhelming odds, British troops of the 41st Brigade melted under German fire, creating a gap in the line that stretched to the village of La Hamel and the River Somme. So you can imagine the 9th Brigade are in this sector, and their whole left flank in this area had melted under German fire. Okay. With their left flank fully exposed, the 35th Battalion were forced to withdraw to a support line occupied by the 33rd Battalion on the outskirts of Villers-Bretonneux, where they held ground against repeated German assaults until the gap was filled with British cavalry. Now, Australian field guns from the 3rd Division were up on Morlancourt Ridge on the northern banks of the Somme, were able to then fire an enfilade from the sides, devastating fire on all remaining German attempts to spill through and advance towards Villers-Bretonneux. So the Germans are assaulting through this area here, but Australian field guns set up along this ridge are able to fire in enfilade and hit them in the flanks and prevent them from advancing in this area. And just for reference, if there's Villers-Bretonneux, the Australian National Memorial and Hill 104 is over in this area. So the British 41st Brigade and its withdrawal from that area was indeed a crisis during this fighting. Now, the fighting at Villers-Bretonneux had been a near-run thing, but it was not the only crisis developing in the approaches to Amiens. No sooner had the rattle of rifle fire began echoing in the woods around Villers-Bretonneux, 2.5 German infantry divisions hit the 2 under-strength Australian brigades still strung out along the railway embankment at Dernancourt, in where they experienced perhaps what the Australians, what was considered probably the heaviest attack experienced by the AIF on the Western Front. No, we'll go back this way. Utilising the cover of a thick mist that had settled in the flats before, in the low flats on the Ancre River before dawn, German stormtroops silently probed the Australian positions between the 2 brigades and succeeded in infiltrating the thin defensive screen set up along the railway embankment, which we see here in the photograph. They made their way up the road towards a chalk quarry further up the hill, where Australian gunners of the 21st Machine Gun Company were positioned to deal with any further German attacks developing along that road. But those gunners had received no orders to have their guns set up for fear of being observed and subject to German bombardment. So we have a map here explaining what was happening. There's the gap between, there's Dernancourt village. We have the railway line down here, and all this ground here is all high ground. We have a road that runs past a quarry, and that's really the brigade boundary. We have the 13th Brigade on this side, and then we have the 12th Brigade on this side, and the guns are set up in this quarry trying to deal with that very vulnerable part of the line. The German troops infiltrated the first line of Australian defences, made their way up to the quarry, and encircled it. Now, the gunners in that quarry were captured without firing a shot, and I have a quote from one of the men. He said, "The Germans had surrounded the chalk pit and had full command of the only entrance to it. We surrendered. There was no alternative. The Germans motioned us to move out of the pit and on towards Dernancourt." And those guys were some of around 400 men who were captured in the fighting that followed. With the key to the Australian defences disabled, German troops assaulted the railway embankment and overran parts of the 12th Brigade positions, killing and capturing the defenders and causing troops on their flanks to withdraw to the Australian main line of resistance further up the hillside. Striking for the Albert to Amiens road, which is this road here, another Roman road leading between Albert and Amiens further down, probably about 10 kilometres away. The German troops became under sustained rifle and machine gun fire from the 45th Battalion, who were further up that hillside, several hundred metres behind the railway embankment. And later that day, those very troops carried out a very successful counterattack that prevented the German troops from reaching the road. His position having been spared the brunt of the German assault, Sgt Stan McDougald gave almost a repeat performance of his Victoria Cross action just a few days earlier by snatching up a Lewis gun, racing to an exposed position and pouring fire on assaulting German units as they spilled over the embankment. A German rifle bullet pierced the gun's cooling jacket. MacDougall then crawled 180 metres under intense rifle and machine gun fire to retrieve another gun, which he got into action, and later led his platoon in a counterattack where they helped stop the Germans from advancing further up the hill. Now, MacDougall was originally recommended for the Distinguished Conduct Medal and resulted, but this was downgraded and he received a military medal for his efforts. An excerpt from his citation described MacDougall as absolutely fearless and his contempt of danger amazing. The attacks of the 4th and 5th of April marked an end of Operation Michael and the concerted German efforts to capture Amiens. While German troops had taken important ground that threatened the stability of the Allied front, their attacks had been costly in men and materiel amid stiffening resistance from British and French formations. For the Australians, the 2nd and the 5th Divisions, still in the north, were brought down to bolster British defences between Albert and the Luc River, and between 5th and the 7th of April, as the line began to settle, the Australian troops of the 5th and 6th Brigades clashed with German troops over the possession of Monument, Lancer and Hangard Wood, south of Villers-Bretonneux. Now, with Amiens, with their drive on Amiens now a forlorn hope, senior German commanders were able to keep the momentum going during their offensives by launching what was known as Operation Georgette further to the north against the British positions along the River Lys in Flanders and in Artois on the 9th of April, where their objective was to capture the important railway junction at Hazebrouck. And here we have our Kiwi map again. And what the Germans, this is Georgette up here in the north, and what the Germans are trying to do is overrun what is the Ypres salient. They succeed in overrunning parts of this line here to try and capture Hazebrouck, which again is another one of those logistical hubs in the north. By capturing Hazebrouck, you're actually cutting off the British and Allied forces that are still slugging it out in the Ypres salient. Now, with the main assault in this sector hitting the poorly trained 2nd Portuguese Division around Neuve-Chapelle, the line collapsed, causing German troops to spill through the already shattered British 40th Division and beyond. Armentières, Flaubert, and the positions the Australians had occupied at Messines the previous winter were forced to be abandoned, bringing the Germans to within striking distance of Hazebrouck. Now, the 1st Australian Division had arrived in Amiens to join the rest of the Australia Corps, beginning to muster on the Somme, but it was ordered to immediately return to the north, taking up positions outside the town of Strasille, where the 1st and 2nd Brigades repulsed wave after wave of German infantry in bitter fighting throughout 13th and 14th of April. According to one man of the 3rd Battalion, it was, and I quote, like firing into a haystack, one could simply not miss. In the end, the French reserves arrived to bolster the Allied defences, and after further attempts to try and penetrate the line north of Kimmel, German forces were unable to exploit their breakthrough any further. Like Operation Michael, Georgette was also a failure. Over the following weeks, the Australian divisions bolstered their defences in respective sectors to thwart any further German progress. The 5th Australian Division was moved south of the Somme River, with the 15th Brigade at Blangy-Tronville to the west of Villers-Bretonneux, and the 14th Brigade occupying positions on the ever-important Hill 104. Villers-Bretonneux was by this stage occupied by British troops of the 8th Division, which had suffered exceptionally heavy casualties during the fighting in late March and had been replenished with recruits who had been rushed across the English Channel, having received little or no real training. And I think that's really important. I think the narrative, the predominant public narrative of the British during this stage, particularly on the Fifth Army front, was that they gave up, they surrendered, or they were overrun and they were completely shattered. There's tens of thousands of British reinforcements that are coming on over on a weekly basis. There's roughly about 10,000 British reinforcements arriving on the Western Front each week, and then during the German Spring Offensive, that they come over in 30 wave packets, and then 70,000 wave packets to go to these formations which had previously been shattered, but then are being rebolstered with young recruits or young conscripts. While the Germans lacked the manpower and resources to make one final thrust on Amiens, they attacked Villers-Bretonneux and the highly important high ground of Hill 104. With the town now reduced to rubble, the Germans deluged it with gas and high explosive before the German troops assaulted it through a dense fog on the morning of the 24th of April 1918. Their attack was spearheaded by 13 A7V tanks, which included Mephisto, the A7V tank that was here on display for last year and beyond, which clashed with British tanks on the outskirts of town and caused the young and inexperienced British soldiers of the 8th Division to break. By mid-morning, the Germans had held the southern end of Hill 104 in Villers-Bretonneux and the south, which included both Monuments and Hangard Wood. Now, the 5th Australian Division carried out an attack the following day, and the 4th and 5th Australian Divisions carried out an attack the following day, and what was a defining moment of the AIF's battle experience on the Western Front. By the time the Australians were ordered to fix their bayonets, however, British troops had already bore the brunt of the German attack, and the German units in and around Villers-Bretonneux were exhausted from the previous day's fighting. They're not fit troops, they're not fresh for the events which followed. And in the early hours of the 24th and 25th of April 1918, on what was the 3rd anniversary of the Gallipoli landing, the 13th and 15th Brigades received orders from British 4th Army to advance on Villers-Bretonneux in a pincer-like manoeuvre and assault the German positions under the cover of a dense pre-dawn fog. Private Walter Downing of the 57th Battalion described how German flares of all kinds shot in the air. Here I quote, "A snarl came from the throat of the mob, the fierce low growl of tigers scenting blood. There was a howling as of demons as the 57th Battalion, fighting mad, drove through the wire. The wild cry rose to a voluminous, vengeful roar that was heard by the 13th Brigade on the far side of Villers-Bretonneux. They killed and they killed. Bayonets passed with ease through grey-clad bodies and were withdrawn with the sucking noise. The English who were with us were mere boys and without arms until they could find a rifle, were fighting with fists and boots, happy so long as they knew where to find the Australians put in charge of them." Some fairly grim stuff. There's a map of the 13th and 15th Brigades assault on Villers-Bretonneux, ejecting the Germans from the town. The Australian National Memorial and Hill 104 is about a kilometre up this road, okay? And we have the 15th Brigade assaulting in that pincer-like manoeuvre around the northern side of Villers-Bretonneux, and the 13th Brigade, with some Brits, along through the south here. So, but it's really important, again, the Australians weren't operating under the Australia Corps Command. They were subordinate to British 4th Army, who had ordered that they take part in the assault. If there's any Australians who are perhaps likely or should be celebrated for the recapture of Villers-Bretonneux, it was Pompey Elliott and Tom Glasgow, the 2 brigade commanders at that time. We'll just wait until question time and we can get to that one. And we have to wait for a microphone, remember? Yep. By dawn, the 2 Australian brigades had linked up on the western side of Villers-Bretonneux. Monument Wood remained in German hands, but the town had been saved a second time, and with that, Amiens was no longer under threat. And here we have some of the German prisoners who were captured during that fearful counterattack, luckily to be spared by Australian infantrymen by the sounds of it. If we take Walter Downing's account as what went down. The AIF had lost heavily in the battles in March and April 1918, suffering over 18,400 battle casualties, which included 3,500 dead across the 5 already depleted infantry divisions. Amiens had been saved and the Germans were prevented from achieving any further breakthrough in the north of France, but the Australian Corps had lacked the manpower and was forced to disband battalions, with 3 brigades to bring up others back to fighting strength. MacDougall's battalion was one of them. It was collapsed and he went to the 47th Battalion. Now, while these losses had significant consequences for the Australians and their ability to withstand further losses in the fighting in 1918, they had not been as severe as the British formations that had bore the brunt of the German offensive. The British had suffered a staggering 255,000 casualties during Operation Michael and a further 82,000 during Operation Georgette, with the certainty of much harder fighting in the months to come. The series of actions fought by the AIF in France throughout March and April 1918 are little known in Australia today, perhaps a reflection of the desperate series of battalion and brigade actions that they fought in support of British formations across a relatively wide front in France and Belgium. Costly though these actions were, they helped blunt any further German attempt to achieve a decisive breakthrough. With their backs against the wall, the Australian troops had contributed to the defence of Amiens, which in turn allowed the British and the Allied armies to prepare their own counter-offensive that resulted in the victory in November 1918. Thank you very much. All right. All right, so we have the gentleman up here who's very keen and eager to ask some questions. Who was the British commander in charge? Who was the 4th Army commander who issued the orders for the recapture of Villers-Bretonneux? That was General William Rawlinson, who issued that order. It's Rawlinson's 4th Army, which is in charge of the counterattack and the capture of Villers-Bretonneux. So we have some differing names. It wasn't John Monash in charge of, who was the person responsible for the recapture of Villers-Bretonneux. He wasn't the Australian Corps commander at that time. It was both an Australian and British victory. So Rawlinson, Elliott, and Tom Glasgow all share that it was their victory.
Thank you.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? Up here in the front. Yep.
Thank you. To what extent do you think the losses in 3rd EPA, particularly the Passchendaele section of that, contributed to the weakness of the British defences during Operation Michael?
Well, certainly the British units that copped the brunt of the fighting on the Somme in late March 1918, they had all fought at Ypres. And so they had all suffered, as had the Australians, as did the Canadians and also the New Zealanders. So all the British Empire troops all the units had been withered down and were probably at their lowest throughout the war. But bear in mind, there's tens of thousands of fresh reinforcements coming over from Britain as well. The quality, perhaps, of the soldiers is probably the major difference. The British, owing to those large number of casualties, are forced to undergo a major restructure of the British Army. So their divisions are much smaller, and you have conscripts who are now filling uniforms which at the start of the war were purely by volunteers. Your cadre of skilled and experienced professional soldiers is much smaller, and I get the impression too, as were the case with the 8th Division at Villers-Bretonneux, those conscripts are being rushed over with receiving fairly modest training. Yeah, so I think, the fighting at 3rd EPA really has an impact on all the armies fighting on the Western Front, but most specifically the British, including the Australians.
You touched on the narrative to do with the apparent withdrawal or rush backwards of the British troops. Where's that narrative coming from? Is that a narrative that's built up around the ability of the Australians to come in and plug the gaps, or was it a broader narrative from both the British and perhaps the French?
I think it's the former. I think the Australian infantry, they're heading up to the forward line. They're passing waves and waves of British troops who received orders to withdraw, largely owing to a miscommunication or a misinterpretation of orders, and being told you can't stop the Germans. The diggers themselves, they certainly believe that, and perhaps they believe the British Army, they're at the end of their bottle is full. They're not prepared to fight. And certainly when the 4th Division guys who fall in the line near Dernancourt relieve the exhausted Scots of the 9th Division, the Scots are slapping them on the back saying, oh, God, we're bloody good to see you guys. And the Australians are they revered these Scots for staying at their posts and fighting. But let's not forget too, entire British units were decimated during the Spring Offensive. We're talking about entire battalions being reduced, either killed, wounded, captured. The British lost a staggering 77,000 men as prisoners alone during that first week of the German Spring Offensive. So. I think that narrative of the Brits not staying at their posts, I think it largely comes from the Australians, and that ultimately influences the narrative that we hear today. But of course there's other things going on, particularly at that higher command, and a misinterpretation of orders on that core front, south of Albert.
Does it all come down to leadership? The Australians by 1918 were highly professional, those who were leading them, and a lot of them had started as privates and made it to colonels.
Yeah.
Whereas with the British, a lot of their best had been wasted in Passchendaele. What was left over had to look after all these conscripts being rushed ashore, which Lloyd George held back because he didn't trust Haig anymore, because he thought Haig was going to do what the Germans did. So he was worried and he held them back. And then they weren't trained properly. When they were under decent leadership, like where they worked with the Australians, they showed their courage.
Yeah.
And the trouble for the British by that time of the war was lack of good leaders.
Yeah, that's
From the top down too, especially with Haig.
That's true. That's true. To take your point, and that's true to a certain extent, because there's also some fine and capable British commanders as well, from the top down. The whole British Army, which includes the AIF, is undergoing this learning process. So you do have, even in the British Army, you have guys who start off with privates who are skilled and experienced NCOs who then become junior leaders as well, and battalion commanders. So there is that process that we see throughout the Australian forces also going on throughout the British Army, but certainly perhaps on a command level that might be a bit different.
Just on from that, the counterattack back by Glasgow, when he told was it Butler that he was his immediate, that he said to him, we want to fight later in the night when it's dark, and the British would have had them attacking in daylight.
Yeah,
they wouldn't have been successful.
Well, that's right. I mean, that under cover of the darkness is certainly, they use that to their advantage, and also the fog. The 13th Brigade, we also have to bear in mind too, had copped a flogging at Dernancourt. They had lost a lot of guys at Dernancourt, so they're already reduced in strength. So perhaps Glasgow is certainly conscious of the fact it doesn't want to lose more men in what was in this next attack.
By 1918, the Australians, like Glasgow, had the confidence to tell the British, no, later on.
What I also find interesting about that counteroffensive, particularly the 15th Brigade guys, they're the same guys who'd been up against the Germans at Fromelles, and they were annihilated at Fromelles. And even though the 15th Brigade was involved in the action at Polygon Wood, this is the first major time that the entire brigade can get the jump on the Germans. So I also wonder whether or not their ferocity in their bayonet work is a result of dishing it back to the Germans after the hiding they got at Fromelles.
What is your opinion of General Gough taking the blame, so to say, for the losses in Operation Michael, which obviously led the way to General Birdwood taking over command of the Third Army, which then in turn led Monash to take command of the Australian Corps? You think he was fairly or unfairly blamed for the British inability to hold back the Germans, or was it a case of he does nothing he could have done?
You've caught me out. I don't really know. I haven't got an answer for you. I don't know, and I'll probably have to research one and get one back to you. But certainly, I mean, Gough had certainly been caught out a number of times. I mean, Gough is the architect behind the attack on Bullecourt in April 1917, which is the debacle. He's involved in attacks during the Third Battle of Ypres and the resulting of massive casualties and no ground gain. So I think for Gough, whether it was his fault or not, it certainly was the last straw for him, and he's replaced thereafter. So, but I'm going to have to get back to you. I don't know. At the front here.
I think Les Carline suggested that Gough got the sack for something he probably couldn't really have done a lot about, when he should have been sacked half a dozen times for things that probably shouldn't have seen him in that position in the first place. But he was not well. A lot of people were sort of saying, no, do not send my troops into Gough's sector. I think the Canadians, in fact, refused to
flat out
fight under
refused.
his command.
That's right. They flat out refused and fought very hard to remain in the area around Arras.
Talking about MacDougall, the Lewis gun's a fairly heavy weapon. I mean, compared to the later Bren gun, I think, it was quite heavy. So he must have been pretty strong guy, pretty big guy.
Yeah. A light Lewis gun, a light machine gun, it ain't. I can assure you of that. It weighs about 35 kilos without a full pannier of ammunition. MacDougall's an interesting guy. He relishes a fight. And he also is a timber cutter from Tasmania. He's a stocky built bloke. is a Scot, loves a punch on, and has ever since Lewis gun training has itched for the opportunity to pick up a Lewis gun and fire it from the hip. And that's precisely what he does. Afterwards, Charles Bean, the Australian then war correspondent and later official historian, he interviewed MacDougall after his first Durnan Corps action. And one of his colleagues, Sergeant Lawrence, was with him. And MacDougall deferred to Lawrence and said it was the best day fighting we ever had. Wasn't it, Laurie? I think you really get the sense that this guy's a bit of a cad, loves a punch on, and certainly I think his simple physique from his civilian life, as well as adrenaline and seeing an opportunity to change the tide of the battle, he went for it, and it worked in his favour. Yeah, up back.
Thank you for your talk, Dr. Pegram. As a MacDougall from Tasmania, but as far as I know, no relative of Stan McDougald, I thought I'd ask a question. My question is about the British Commonwealth and French intelligence failure leading up to Operation Michael. Just wondering if you could expand a little on that, because I would have thought by then their intelligence machine would be a very well-oiled machine.
Yeah, absolutely. The British and French armies knew an offensive was coming. They had no idea on what front it was to fall. The conduct of operations on the Western Front is always this movement of divisions up and down the line to try and counteract attacks. That's what the Germans do for most of the war against the British and French, who are mainly on the assault. And once the Eastern Front had collapsed, there was no illusion that the Germans wouldn't try and carry out an assault in the West. I mean, they had this window of opportunity. There was over 1 million men freely available. The Americans are starting to arrive in France. There's over 1 million of them, but they're not yet combat ready. So there's this small window of opportunity. The British and French know about it. And there's also a really good story. Lieutenant Frank Bethune, Australian Machine Gun Company lieutenant, his men are holding a position near Spoil Bank in Belgium. He orders his men that the attack's coming in the coming days, and I order you to stay at your posts, and you will stay at your posts until you are dead, or words to that effect. So I think it ultimately comes down to, it's not an intelligence failure. I just don't think the British and French armies knew that it was coming on the Somme battlefields against British 3rd and 5th armies, on that front. But again, it was that very vital link along the Somme River, which intended to split the British and French armies. Perhaps it should have been the forefront of their mind. We don't know. And I get the impression too that they were expecting offensive further in the north around Ypres and the Artois area. So, yeah, I think I bumbled my way through an answer there. Okay. Any further questions? No.
Aaron, we have a couple of questions from the Facebook.
Feed. Okay, from the interwebs. Great.
The interwebs, yes. Let me just read them. First one: did superior Allied weapons give them an advantage during the defending against the German spring offensive?
I don't think there was a superior weapons as such, but certainly what both the British and the Allies were doing, I mean, what they were doing, their numbers were greatly reduced, okay, in terms of material and manpower. We've discussed that, several times. What they made up was with their numbers was with machine guns. And certainly the Australian infantry platoons who are going into action are defending areas with Lewis guns and Vickers guns. I mean, they feature quite prominently in the paper. And the Germans, they've been using machine guns exceptionally well during the fighting in the Third Battle of Ypres. I think it ultimately comes down to acceptable losses or losses for an attacking formation against a defending formation, because those who are attacking are ultimately going to be coming up against artillery and machine guns in great numbers, and ultimately going to be inflicting or suffering greater casualties than those who are defending. So I think this is the first major time in the fighting on the Western Front since the fighting in 1914, where the British and the Allied armies are holding fire or holding ground. They have interlocking cones of fire, and they're doing their best to withstand the German onslaught. Yes, they give ground, but they also inflict massive casualties amongst the Germans.
Thanks, Aaron. We had another question from Facebook.
Great.
Do we have any unit commanders' reports on the morale of the troops in front of the German advance on Amiens? And if so, do we know anything about the way they responded to that advance?
Australian reports, I imagine?
I imagine Australian is implied, but British as well?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't actually gone through British records and the British sort of battalion commanders looking at specifically at morale. But I'd imagine too the British was suffering, just as the Australians, issues of morale following the Third Battle of Ypres. The war was going on looking forward to another hard year of fighting. The British had also fought on the Somme and also the Third Battle of Ypres, and there was this looming German offensive. Well, of course, perhaps men, their bottles were full, willing to give in. But then also too, and that's symptomatic of the Australians. We had a summer scholar earlier this year, Danielle Broadhurst, who looked at the Australians in the during that relatively quiet period around Messines in the Ypres sector during the winter of 1918. The Australians had a morale problem. They nicked off. They got venereal diseases. They did whatever they could to not go back to the front line. Okay. But then that's also matched by, the 3rd and 4th Australian Division straining on the leash to get stuck into the Germans in the fighting on the Somme. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. Okay. Never had so many questions. This is fantastic.
Thought I might take the opportunity to just ask you to perhaps speculate on how close the Germans got at various points to actually really getting a true breakthrough that may have really altered the course of the war, or whether in fact, albeit with the value of 2020 hindsight, they really, it was a last throw that was kind of destined to fail, even if they could have got a bit further west and the like.
I think it's the latter. I don't think the Germans they achieved a breakthrough of sorts. They achieved a break from the old 1916 battlefields, but I don't think they had a snowflake's chance in actually breaking through British and French lines, and that comes down to the German commanders. Erich Ludendorff is instead of deferring his multiple offensives or just picking on one major offensive or one discrete area and combining his logistics and his troops into one area, you have multiple offensives over a much broader area. So your attacks are being done with fewer and fewer troops. Not a great deal of thought have been put into the logistical infrastructure. We see a breakthrough of 60 kilometres on the British front, and the German troops are unable to sustain their logistics on that front. I mean, what happens if they got to Amiens? What could they do? I wonder whether or not if Ludendorff had put all his eggs in one basket and really hit the Somme with 1 million German troops and had greater consideration to the logistical efforts in supporting and feeding and supplying his men, then perhaps that could have been the case. But the way they panned out, like I said, Ludendorff didn't have a snowflake's chance.
You were asked to comment earlier about the relative values of the armaments that each army had. I would have thought that the Germans had no equivalent of the Lewis gun, did they?
They had a variant. They had the MGO 815, which was a portable version of their sledge-mounted machine gun, and it was portable. It was a light machine gun. In its capabilities, not in its actual weight. And the German stormtroop units were also employing captured British Lewis guns. So they were rechambered, of course, for the 7mm cartridge. But they probably weren't as numerous as what the Lewis gun was for the British Army.
And also the British had pretty good tanks by that time, didn't they?
Yeah, that's another thing too. The tanks don't really sort of come into the fighting during the spring offensive until much later on during that fighting around Villers-Bretonneux. They have a new and improved Mark IV on its way. They've also gone through various iterations of tank types. They have the lighter Whippet tanks. They also have support tanks as well. The Germans, they've put all their eggs in one basket in in manufacturing submarines and left it very late in the war to develop tanks, and so much so that there's only 20 of them developed, the A7Vs, and obviously Mephisto being one of them. So I guess in that regard, yes, the British do have tanks, so do the French, but the Germans also have a massive amounts of artillery as well. So all different considerations. Yeah.
Just like to come back to your point there about the logistics and the supporting the attempted breakthrough along the Somme there. A commentator in the last couple of days in one of the major papers talked about the interaction of the strategic and the tactical, whereby the blockade of Germany had put the Germans largely on starvation of very basic rations. And then in that breakthrough, the Germans were then coming across villages which had been behind the front lines, which had a good supply of both wine and, shall we say, meats in the cellars, and were therefore pausing and also not paying attention to that resupply line. So you're getting both the diversion of your front troops and your support troops. I was wondering if there's anything in your reading that sort of points to the wisdom of that, or whether it's sort of isolated instance.
I was listening to a podcast just the other day with British historian Peter Hart, who has spent a career interviewing veterans, and in his earlier years interviewed a lot of First World War veterans. And British soldiers arriving over on the Western Front in 1918 knew very little German, but from the German prisoners that they were handling and leading to the rear, they came upon the phrase, "Haben Sie Fleisch?" Do you have any meat? There's a lot of things going on in the German wartime economy, and it's not just the blockade, which is the Royal Navy's blockade of Germany, which is affecting production. Germany had prepared for a quick, mobile war, not necessarily a long, drawn-out war on multiple fronts. And its wartime economy was geared towards the production of war materials and not the domestic needs of Germany. So when the war does grow in scale and its intensity and its duration, I mean, the Germans are fighting on the Eastern Front, the Russians against the Italians in the Balkans, in the Middle East, and of course on the Western Front. They're also waging an unrestricted U-boat campaign as well. All this has a massive effect on the ability of the German forces to supply itself, and also has a detrimental effect on the civilians as well. And the Royal Navy does have has a major problem, has an effect on that. But certainly by even 1916, the effects of the war are being felt in the pits of German stomachs. There's strict wartime rationing that's ersatz foodstuffs, so commodities. They're drinking tea made out of coffee made out of roasted acorn and bread made from sawdust. And certainly, so by 1918, things are so desperate that yes, your German troops are advancing over supply depots where there's tinned meat, Haben Sie Fleisch. There's caviar, there's champagne, and these German troops who themselves, they've seen a lot of combat. They probably see their offensive is not going to succeed. They sit down, hunker down, and tuck in. Yeah, but it doesn't, in its own right, result in the German offensive coming to a halt. Yeah. Okay. I think I've dealt with all those questions. There's a barrage of questions. This is great. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much for joining me, and thank you to all those who joined us over Facebook and YouTube. It's been a blast. Hopefully that talk has given you a greater consideration to some of the actions that the Australians faced during the opening stages of 1918. For those of you who are here, I'm encouraging you all to go and check out the First World War galleries. Many of those objects and items which I was talking about during the talk are on display. Sgt McDougall's Lewis gun and his Victoria Cross medal group. Now before I wrap up, I was dared to make a Lord Flashart reference during the talk, and I'd like to just say woof to Cameron. So I've felt obliged to do that before we wrapped up. So thank you all very much. It was great to have you all here.